Higher.
Ew.
Mira.
Longer. Faster.
Problema.
Curando.
Listen.
Engage. Cysylltu.
Cynrychioli.
Represent.
Hello, and welcome to the Welsh Athletics Autumn Online Webinar Series. My name is Matt Elias, and I'll be hosting today's webinar, which is going to be around training for the competition phase. And this will be specifically looking at some of the speed events, but this covers the whole spectrum across the board. I won't necessarily be going into the detail of session planning and things like that within each of the events. This is more around factors you should look at before you start programming any training around competition phases. So let's get started. So as I said, some of the objectives for this evening, it's looking at effective ways of planning your training. As I said, it's not necessarily the specific detail of each session. That is up to your creativity as a coach. But this is more around, the planning of those sessions, how to fit them in, where, why, and all the things you should be thinking of. And then appropriate competition selection around what competitions to select, why, tapering down for target competitions, and then off the back of that, developing a athlete-centered approach. Now, tonight's webinar, it's going to be a bit more short and sharp. I think some of the ones that I've presented on previously become a little bit too detail orientated and kind of lose their way a little bit. So I've tried to keep this quite streamlined tonight and have it more effective in just things as a coach that you should take into consideration anytime you're approaching a competition phase with an athlete, and then obviously putting training plans together around that. So that's the idea. Hopefully we shall hit some of these objectives and you find this webinar interesting. There will be a thing at the end where I'll put up my contact details if you'd like to ask any questions. Okay, so before you start thinking about the sort of training pre-competition and training in the build-up to competitions, before any of that, I think it's good as a coach to really take a step back and understand the potential stress that the competition environment creates. So, and what I've put here, the complexity of competition stresses, because it's multifaceted. There's many things that go into competing within athletics, and there's many stress factors that you have to take into consideration. So, as I say, competition. What is competition? What are the stresses that can have that? And there are many of them. So the first thing, realistically, that competition brings for the athlete is performance goals. So with performance goals, again, they'll actually have an element of stress added to them. So is the athlete focused on the outcome? Are they focused on the process? Or is there potentially a focus on failure? First and foremost, it's understanding what goals the athlete has and what sort of stress that can add in. On top of that, then you've got to throw into the mix family, because family can be a good thing, but it can also potentially add stress. There's pressure from parents, siblings, whoever it may be within the family. And as much as sometimes the family think they're creating positive environments, it can actually add stress to the athletes. It can add expectation. It can be a positive influence. They can add support. So it's all of these things that you need to understand. I've added in their personal life and coach. I think we'll get onto some of those things in a little while, but it's having that understanding of the external implications to the family that creates another stress for that athlete. If you're working with young athletes, they'll obviously be still in school. So you need to understand, obviously, specifically around things like heavy exam periods, if they're doing any other sports in school, if they've got any deadlines for coursework and so on and so forth coming up. All of these things will have a massive impact on the athlete's performance at a competition, and then also what you should be doing with those athletes in the build-up to the competition. All of these things add a little bit of pressure, a little bit of stress, and all of those things can actually potentially end up being a negative influence on the competition. And the one thing you don't want competition to ever be for an athlete is a negative kind of outcome, or not a negative outcome as such, but a negative thing that they have to deal with. You want competition to be a positive environment, so you need to understand those. And as well, if you're working with older athletes, the potential issues around work. And it sounds simple, but little things to speak to the athletes with around, can they get the time off of work for the competitions that you want them to do? Are they getting appropriate sort of rest and recovery from when they finish work to when they get to a competition? All of these factors will create another stressor for what is already a massively stressful environment when you're performing on an athletics track. Again, stresses to look at in terms of where the athlete is in terms of their age, their experience levels, the size of competition. They could be a very young athlete that hasn't had a lot of experience in the sport, where potentially competition then is just a bit of a fun environment that they want to see how they get on. As they get a bit older, some expectations start to creep into the mix. Potentially they'll be going to bigger competitions. All of these factors will play a part in the added stress of that competition. So again, another factor to bear in mind. And then obviously you have the individual, you have the person. They have their own expectations, they have their own confidences, but on the flip side of that, they also have fears. What fatigue are they carrying? Potential previous injuries can have a massive impact on the psychological side of things going into competition. So those are just a few that I've put down. There are a lot more. If you start going down this, it's a bit of a rabbit hole, and you can kind of keep going and keep going. But these are just sort of 5 key areas of life that I think have a very important part to play for us as coaches when we start planning training towards a competition. So we need to make sure we understand all of these external stressors that are put onto the athlete that the competition environment creates. And I think if we can start understanding these a little bit more, we'll be able to effectively manipulate training on the way in, so that we're not overloading or overstressing an athlete, that they're having a positive run into a competition, which hopefully should then breed a positive outcome for that athlete in the competition. By acknowledging the family pressure and expectations as well, it gives the athlete the ability with you as a coach to talk about it, what they're feeling, because sometimes they may be a little bit scared to speak to their parents about the pressure and about what they're feeling. And you as a coach, if you acknowledge that, it may give them that outlet to be able to talk about these things that you could then potentially address with parents pre-competition or in the build-up to competitions, to try and get them setting positive environments that the athletes are then really looking forward to them. And again, just having an understanding of all of these things, because as much as we all love to compete, there is definitely an element of stress that comes with it. And then off the back of stress, there's a big element of fatigue that creates. Even if it's a positive outcome, you will still have a big level of fatigue and a bit of a come down at the end of it. And again, if it's a negative one, then yeah, it's going to be a bit of a rebuilding job. So I think it's understanding the whole of the cycle and the whole of where everything fits in together before you even start planning the specific detail of what you are going to give an athlete in their training and the build up to competition. Okay, so once we've kind of looked at the stressors of what the competition environment can create, and we understand that, we can then start looking at those factors that we'd like to take into consideration when we start planning the training, and then the kind of specific detail in what we are actually going to write. So for me, the first factor as you come into any competition cycle is the event specificity of the training must kind of sharpen focus. I think in Britain, because of pre-indoor training facilities, we would tend to have lots of long to short training programs, a lot of long distance slug type training in the winter, and then once you hit the summer, more speed work. But for me, it's having a little bit more relevance and specificity around that, and having everything event specific. So if you've got a short sprinter, looking at certain aspects of block clearance and so on and so forth, hurdles, doing some relevant runs over race distance hurdles for specific heights, whatever it is. But the first thing should be the event specificity of the training itself. It doesn't need to be high volumes. The volumes can be really shrunk right down, because the last thing we want to do is create fatigue in athletes when they're going into a competition environment. Second thing to potentially look at is, again, technical development. So linked to the event specificity, use competitions to develop areas of technical efficiency that you want to see out of the athletes. And that's where it's great to have an idea of your kind of annual plan and then the competition plan through the summer, so you can kind of differentiate between early competitions and then some of your main focus competitions through the heart of the summer. And what I would say is, actually during your early competition phases, use those competitions to work on some of the weaknesses of the athletes. So if you have a 400-meter hurdler and you're just starting a new stride pattern, or you're looking at developing a stride pattern, use your first couple of races as a big technical focus on working on that stride pattern development. For a sprinter that may be struggling with transition, then potentially you could do some work in the build-up where you're doing some longer block clearance runs up into the max sort of posture and towards max velocity, where you're working on that transition up. And then once you've done all those in the early season competitions, it's a case of then focusing on the athlete's strengths when you get to the main competitions. Once you get to the main competitions is when you want your athlete the most confident within themselves, and to be that, athletes intrinsically will always rely on their strengths. So the more that you focus on the athlete's strengths around that time, get their confidence up, get them feeling good after working on some of the weaknesses early season, then that would be a kind of positive way to go about things in planning some of the training that you're doing in the build up to those competitions. Working on process goals in training is key. Often with young developing athletes and then potentially young coaches, the competition is always outcome driven. In our sport, it's very easy to get outcomes because there's a clock ultimately, and you're judged on however fast you run on whatever given day. But it's a very easy thing to get drawn into that potentially can create issues around negative, what athletes see as negative performances. Because ultimately, we're not going to be running personal best every time we step on the track. We know that as athletes get faster, conditions will play a very big part in them being able to set personal best. You don't often see 100-meter runners or 200-meter runners setting personal best if they're running into headwinds. Again, same with hurdlers, and then we don't see 400 or 400-meter hurdlers necessarily running personal bests in big, open, windy stadiums. So it's a good idea to start getting the athletes to focus on the processes, because then whatever the outcome, they will be able to take a positive from it. So if they go to a competition and you're focusing on, for a short sprinter, the block clearance, or you're working on them finishing the race with their speed endurance the best it's ever been, or holding speed endurance for longer in the race, it gives you something to break down with the athlete post competition. And then this can also feed into your training in the build up to that competition. If you're working a 200-meter runner and the skill development or the technical component that you're working on in this race is your transition off the bend, in the week building up to that, you should focus on doing some transition runs off the bend. It wouldn't make sense that if that's your focus in the build up to that week, you're just doing a load of block starts or you're doing a load of speed endurance. Try and link the skill that you want to develop in the competition arena, develop it within that kind of time frame pre-competition. And if you explain this to the athlete and talk them through it, they will start understanding how to set those process goals and be much more reflective post-competition on areas that have gone well and areas that they'll be able to work on in the future moving forward. So this is a key one for me, especially with young developing athletes. It's getting out of the mindset of this outcome goal orientation and getting them to understand the skill development side of things and really buy into that process goal. Linked to that as well is the mentality side of things. I think this is something often left to competition day without actually utilizing training to develop some of the skills in the build-up prior to the competitions themselves. So it's getting the athletes to understand the specific mindsets to go into in competition. Everyone is individual. There's no two athletes who are identical. Even twins are not completely identical in the way that they will approach a race mentally and the skills that they will utilize. So something I would factor into your training and your planning of training is skills to develop the mentality. What mindset do you want to take into the competition? Are you the type of athlete, or is the athlete that you're coaching the type of athlete that needs to be relaxed on the day of a competition? Do they need to be taken away from a stressful environment if they're linked to the stresses? If potentially a family could create a negative stressor for them, do they need to be taken away from that earlier in the day, pre-competition? Are they the type of athlete that actually needs to psych themselves up and really almost, as they call it, get into the zone and focus? Are they an athlete that has to be fun and smiling and jovial? That was very much me as an athlete. When I was competing, I tried lots of different things. If ever I got really sort of serious and like narrow focus with everything, I became too intrinsic and I overanalyzed everything, and I'd kind of be a little bit drained by the time I even got onto the start line. But actually, the more extrovert I was, the more I was smiling, laughing, joking, the better I was then when I got onto the start line of the competition. And these were things that I worked on in training. So while I was training with my coach at the time, we would work on being fun and jovial, because that's how I needed to be on competition day. Training didn't need to be too focused and too serious. When the whistle went and the marksman says on your marks, then it is focus time. But up until then, it's having the relaxation. And we see this massively. If you look at the best athletes in the world, and especially everyone's looked at Usain Bolt, he kind of changed that thought process that 100-meter runners or sprinters needs to be very, very focused and a little bit sort of angry almost, it would seem, on the start line, whereas he would sort of laugh and joke around. And then what we saw after that was athletes trying to imitate it, but that wasn't how they are naturally. So it's working on things with the athlete, communicating with the athlete to find out what they're like naturally, and that'll get their best mentality on the day. And I've put on there as well visualization. I think this is a key skill that athletes should be training from a young age, about how to visualize what their body is doing, so that when you're talking to them about certain cues that you'd like to give them, they can understand visually what you're kind of trying to help them develop. So work on this in training. Take some time at the end of sessions where you've got 5 or 10 minutes pre or post cool down, where you get the athlete to lie down, close their eyes, kind of zone out a little bit, and get them to visualize certain areas of the race, again, linked to the process goals that you've worked on. So if you're working as that transition off the bend, or you're working on taking your 15-16 stride pan out to hurdle 6 instead of hurdle 5, get them to visualize that and repeat that visualization over and over and over. Then when they come to do it within the race, they'll have a frame of reference to be able to relate back to when they think about it. So I think plan in the mentality factor within training, because it's a very good tool to use in getting athletes to buy into lots of processes, develop some technical skills, and then also it can act as a tool to help athletes with nerves. If athletes suffer massively with nerves on competition day, some of the visualization techniques and breathing techniques can help bring that heart rate down a little bit and just get that athlete to focus a little bit more positively, as opposed to it feeling like it's a big anxious situation. And then finally, with the factors before you planning your training, understand what's going on in that athlete's life. Like what we said with those stressors pre-competition, you have to understand what the athlete is going through in school or work or university at that time. Are they in exam periods? Have they just broken up with their girlfriend? Whatever it may be, I guarantee you all of these are things that I have gone through as a coach with an athlete that I'm working with, that they haven't been fully open to start with around some of these stressors, and then the performance on the competition side has suffered, and I've been racking my brains around what sort of training did we do that fatigued them, what have I done that's added stress within that, and then a couple of days later they'll sort of open up around the fact that they may have just split up with their girlfriend or lost their job, or they're having issues at home. So the more communication you can have with your athletes consistently through the year, you'll know exactly when these things are going to come up, and hopefully you can get in front of them before they actually cause an issue. And I've actually, since doing this, I've eventually taken athletes out of the competition environment because of stresses that's going on away from the track, that actually the athletics arena would create too much of a negative stress for them and potentially put them in a worse state, could even cause an injury because of the fatigue if they're not sleeping, and so on and so forth. So again, make sure you get on top of these factors. And I think in terms of the worlds that probably most of us as coaches work with, university athletes or athletes in high school, is the exam stress. You'll have some athletes that can sail through school and you wouldn't even notice it, and there's others then that will bottle things up and really kind of drain them. And I had a situation even just last year with an athlete that hadn't told me exactly how many exams they had coming up, and we'd come off of a big training camp, and I thought they were in the shape of their lives, and opened up in a competition environment and just looked so tired and drained, and I was just thinking, oh God, have I overcooked things here? Have we done too much training in the build up to this? And then they tell me that they'd actually had an exam on the morning of the competition, and then they'd had one previous day to that, and then afterwards as well. So all of these factors just play a huge role. So it's understanding where they sit along the spectrum and making sure we take this information on board before we actually start planning our specific training sessions. Okay, so competition selection. Now, this is something very critical, I think, in young developing athletes. There's more and more competition opportunities now, with, especially in the speed world, with these sort of run with the win type meets, as well as then league competitions, championships, and so on and so forth, that there's so many competition opportunities that more doesn't always necessarily mean better. More is not always better. Competition itself creates massive levels of fatigue because of all the external stresses that are involved in it. It ends up creating a lot. So you have to understand that if you are having competitions and you potentially have got 5 or 6 competitions, because the athletes may have school competitions, you may have 5 or 6 competitions in a 3-week period, that athlete is going to have a huge come down at the end of it. And if you're not prepared for that, potentially the outcome is athletes could get injured, they could get ill, they'll start having negative experiences at the track, which they won't want to come back to keep continuing in the sport. So yeah, really dial into terms of allowing adequate recovery between competition times, just with understanding that, and also with the density of the competition. If it's a championship event, or they're doubling up, doing 100 and 200, or they may have heat, semis, and finals. If they're doing 100 and 200 with heat, semis, and finals over 2 days, potentially 6 races in 2 days, that's a huge stress for an athlete that they're probably going to need at least 3, maybe 4 days off as recovery afterwards. So always think about how much fatigue ratio a competition will create when you're planning your strategy around competition selection. When it comes to tapering for some of the larger competitions, it's good to either, if you've been working with your athlete already for a couple of years, or you know that athlete very well, or you need to get to know them, understand how many competitions they need to get themselves to the point where they are really starting to like sharpen up and get to their, like people call it, peaking, or whatever it may be. Some athletes are very good straight off the bat, first race out, they can hit it. Others need a few to get going. So take some information, track everything with your athletes, and work out periodically how many races it usually takes them to sort of get up to proper race speed. As I think I've done the understanding the knock-on effects of competition with the physical and mental in the first bit, so I'll switch over for that. 2 to 3 maximum large focus events. So what you tend to find, especially with some of the younger developing ones, if they have things like Welsh Schools Championships, Welsh Under-20 Championships, SIAB, what would have been the old Celtic Games with other things, Under-20 International, British Under-20 Championships, all of a sudden you've got a lot of focused target events then. What I would sit down with your athlete is go through them and really dial into which ones are the focus and are the target, because every competition can't be. If every competition becomes the be all and end all of their season, the big thing that they're focused on, halfway through the year, you're going to have an athlete just clinging on and just no energy, and it will start becoming a negative influence again. So yeah, I would say to only ever have 2 to 3 real focused target events for that athlete each year. You could potentially have 2 indoors or 1 indoors and then 2 to 3 outdoors as well, but I wouldn't start. I've spoken with coaches before, and they've taken me through their targeted competitions for the year, and they had 10 target competitions with another 10 other competitions they were doing where they were running multiple events. And all of a sudden, by the end of that summer, that athlete had potentially raced in excess of 50 times. And if you're adding training on top of that as well, that is some serious amounts of competition stress that could create some issues potentially for that athlete developing down the road. Because ultimately, we want athletes to enjoy the competition environment as much as possible. As it says there at the bottom, competing must be fun. Once competition is no longer fun, that potentially as an athlete's not going to want to come back to our sport. So make sure we're not over racing athletes, and make sure we're keeping it fresh for them. And again, I said all athletes and people are different. Some athletes might only like to race 6 or 7 times a year. Some athletes might like to race up towards 20 to 25. But if you're starting to go up and over that, then yeah, that is quite a lot. But understand and get to know your athletes where they all could be slightly different. And that's okay. And that's where it's understanding where that athlete fits on that spectrum and tailoring all of the work, all of the competitions that you're going to do for that athlete, not what you think is best for you as a coach or what you think is best for them. It's having that dialogue between the two of you. Okay, tapering and peaking. So this is when we're starting getting into the nitty gritty of the summer. I'm not a huge fan of the term peaking because I think peaking is just an outcome of tapering away some of the volumes and some of the other stressors that are around, and just the natural kind of higher state of arousal that your big target competition will create for that athlete. When you sit down with your athlete at the start of the year and say you're targeting the British Under-17 Championships or the British Under-20 Championships, I guarantee you that you will have subconscious conversations or subconscious comments to the athlete about that competition through the year, and it will grow and it will grow, and they will know as you're coming towards that competition, naturally there will be that heightened state of arousal, so things will naturally get to this peaking kind of mentality. So once we're getting into this world, everything you do should be the best quality. This is not the time of year now to be sort of running high volumes, long, slow reps or whatever it is. It's short, sharp sessions with a couple of facets of whether it's a little bit of power development, block clearance runs, a couple of stride pattern runs for a 400-meter hurdle, whatever the specific detail is. Quality should be the focus. Movement quality, execution of the exercise that you're wanting to do should always be the focus. This is where the volumes are at their lowest. If you're a 400-meter runner and you're a week out from your British Under-20 Championships, or if you've got up to a higher level and you maybe are at European Juniors, something like that, in the build up to that, you might do one event specific run on sort of three to 5 days out where you're doing 1 350 or 1 320 after a couple of sort of block runs around the first bend. Like, it really is low volume. It's massively recovery focused. It's getting the athletes in the right frame of mind so that they're super happy, super energized, and just chomping at the bit to get to that competition. And that's where you use the previous competitions earlier in the summer to get to this point through the year. This doesn't happen by chance. If every competition is always that kind of high intensity, high peak, this is what our whole season is about, you'll never be able to actually lift yourself when you get to certain ones. So that's where, if you get those process goals right in your first 5 or 6 competitions and get the athletes focused in the right way, that by the time you get to your target competitions, naturally, as I said, those arousal levels will increase. The quality of work is as good as it should be. The volume is stripped right out. You've done all your recovery, your therapy, your massage, mobility, whatever it may be. And the outcome of that is you will have a very happy athlete ready to take to that start line. And hopefully, if it's all gone well, then you should have a pretty positive outcome. Oh, outcome. There you go. It's almost like I planned it. So the outcome, if you nail all of those things that I've sort of alluded to, the factors to take into consideration when you're planning everything, that ultimately is an athlete-centered approach. If you have the same approach for every athlete you work with, that's not an athlete-centered approach. That's you as a coach, that it's a generic kind of world. Each athlete needs slightly different stimulus. Some need slightly more, some need slightly less, some need an arm around them, some need a bit of tough love. And it's understanding where the athlete is on their journey, and really getting into the nitty-gritty and detail with that athlete, that then will allow you to really start programming appropriate competitions and appropriate opportunities for them. It's not about, as I said, what you need to do as a coach. It's about what that athlete needs. Ultimately, that is the most important thing. They only have one shot, so we got to give them the best opportunity that we can. So as I said, today wasn't about the specific detail of sessions. That's if we'd done that for every event group specifically, so the 100, the 200, the 400, short hurdles, long, we would have been here all night and all day. And as I said, it's all slightly different. 2 100-meter runners may be slightly different. One of them may need sort of 5 or 6 block starts over quite a long distance to really get them in the right frame of mind to a competition. Another one may need to just do a warm up and 1 or 2 block push outs for 2 or 3 steps, and that's fine. Those athletes are slightly different, so you would program slightly different for them. The whole idea of this session today was to start getting you as a coach to understand the amount of stress that potentially competitions can create, all of the external factors that go into those stresses, and then also starting to understand the process around focusing on competition to eventually get to your main target one with the athlete in the best possible physical and mental condition you can get them to. So as I said, I've tried to keep that a little bit shorter and a little bit sharper tonight, a little bit more digestible. If you do have any specific questions around certain sort of appropriate volumes for training in sort of maybe a 2-week build up to competitions, or specifics around hurdle, how to develop stride length into a competition, lots of these little things, anything you've got specifically with an athlete that you're working with, email me at matt.elias@welshathletics.org. My phone number's there as well. You can text me or give me a call, and I'd be happy to help. So I hope you have all enjoyed this evening's webinar on planning for competition phases. Any questions or ideas that you'd like us to look at in the future, stay safe, look after yourselves, and hopefully there's a little bit of positivity down the line now that we may get a few more competitions going, and 2021 will look a little bit more like a proper athletic season, and I'll be able to catch up with a lot of coaches during this summer.